Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to begin starting tonight's program as our Executive Director, John Wong, continues to admit people from the waiting room. And I want to welcome everyone tonight, our members, board members, members of our local community, and people from a little bit farther away who might be joining us for the first time. So I'll just mention that the Northwest China Council is a nonprofit, non-political organization organized in Portland, Oregon, but with activities around the Pacific Northwest. And we have been here over 40 years now. I guess we're going on 42, to promote a better understanding of China, of US-China relations, and the larger question of the Chinese community around the world, including the USA, where here in Portland, we have an active local Chinese American community that goes back well over 100 years and is active with events at our Portland Chinatown Museum, our Lansu Chinese Garden, and other organizations in the area. Tonight, we are really delighted to have Dr. Chiaoning Su, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Oakland University, joining us to talk about Taiwan. Dr. Su holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from National Taiwan University, an MA in organizational communication from Emerson College, and a PhD in media and communication from Temple University. You might have seen in our announcement, her previous work in journalism and in East Asian geopolitics has been published in Media, Culture, and Society, the International Journal of Communication, the Asian Journal of Communication, and the Taiwan Journal of Democracy, and some others. I hope I got most of them. She's a very busy person. She is the recipient of the 2020 Honors College Inspiration Award and the 2021 Teaching Excellence Award at Oakland University. We have some people with a real interest in communication studies here, so they'll be happy to know that you were the past president of the Association for Chinese Communication Studies. And I guess I could go on, but we need to move on and let you talk. I have a couple of notes to make about procedures. You'll see a Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. That's where you should enter any questions to be submitted, which you can do at any time. There'll be a question and answer period at the end of the lecture. And we like it if you could identify yourself by name, and if you're connected with a educational organization or school, then we can identify that school to our audience as well. So we do have a number of participating local area educational institutions. We will try to review all the questions and get them in the Q&A time. If we run out of time, we'll maybe forward a good question or two on by email, because we want to continue this conversation beyond tonight's event. So I think with that, I will let you see Chiaoning's screen. I'm going to turn mine off for the duration of the lecture, and I'll come back and say hello again after about 40 minutes or so. So please let me do that, and welcome to Portland, Chiaoning Su.
Thank you so much, Jim. So I think first I'm gonna share my slide, and hopefully it's working. Can you all see my slides? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me tonight. It's an honor to be here. Jim and I started this conversation, I think it was last November. I got the first email from Jim talking about this opportunity of me talking to the Northwest China Council about Taiwan. I was very excited about this opportunity itself. And throughout our multiple conversations, I learned that Northwest China Council is a nonprofit educational platform hope to cultivate a international conversation between US and China. So I do hope my presentation tonight, very much focusing on Taiwan, would add a additional dimension, additional aspect to this ongoing conversation. So before I start talking about reporting Taiwan history, transformations, and new opportunities, I would like to just briefly introduce myself and my credential, and then also why I am interested in such topic. So my name is Chiaoning Su. if you think it's hard, just think about Italian ciao, hello, goodbye, and then add ning after that, Chiaoning. That's how you pronounce my name. Currently, I'm an assistant professor of public relations at Oakland University, not in California, but in Michigan. So it is still very wintry here. We had another storm, a snowstorm just last weekend. So the weather is pretty bad, I would say that. I've been here since 2016. And most of what I do is to teach students about journalism, public relations all together. I came to US in 2007 to pursue my PhD degree. I spent the first 9 years of my American experience in East Coast, Boston, Philadelphia, all together. So when I first got this job offer in Michigan, this is my opportunity to explore a different dimension of the United States. And I have to say, I actually really enjoyed the Midwest culture so far. Before my academic career, I actually worked as a political campaign strategist and a PR public relations specialist. So I work in Ogilvy, which is a global PR agency back in Taiwan. I serve multiple clients on the daily basis. I work in big political campaign, political rally. So it was based on that experience, I started to develop my interest in journalism, the symbiotic relationship between journalism and PR, strategic messaging, public diplomacy, and the idea of soft power. And that's why tonight I want to talk about the international media coverage about Taiwan and how that is shaping the global understanding of Taiwan, this vibrant democracy. So where is Taiwan? I mean, my presentation is not going to be so much about geography, but I still want to show you this map so that you have that visual reminder of the location of Taiwan and its relation to Oregon and my current location, which is Michigan. So you can see that Taiwan is this Pacific island that is quite far from here, from the United States. Typically, if I want to go home from Michigan, I would drive like 5 hours, 5.5 hours to Chicago. And then I would catch a direct flight from Chicago O'Hare Airport back to Taiwan. That would be another 15.5 hours of flight. So that's typically how I would go home. But because of COVID, I was not able to do that for about 2.5 years. So I really do hope that this summer I'm able to finally go home and see my family in person for the first time in 2.5 years. Typically, when you think about Oregon and Taiwan, you would think like, oh, they are both, you know, on the share a coastline of the Pacific Ocean. So you would think like these two places might have a lot of similarities. They do. This like ocean culture really defines these two places indeed. But if you dive deeper into some fun facts, you would see that they are also quite different in terms of the size and in terms of the population. So I did some research. I realized that Oregon is actually 7 times bigger than Taiwan in terms of the size. However, if you look into the population, Taiwan actually has way more people than Oregon, actually 5 times more. So think about this, think about these statistics. Oregon is 7 times bigger than Taiwan, but on the other hand, Taiwan has 5 times more people than Oregon. So that gives you a good understanding of Taiwan, this very humid Pacific island with very dense population. Every time when I mention to my students that I am from Taiwan, typically I would get this like indifferent look on their faces. They're like, I know nothing about Taiwan. It's so far, it sounds so foreign, and I'm just not interested. And typically I will use this slide to prove them wrong and to build that connection between themselves and Taiwan. So I will ask them to first look at the left-hand side, and then they see the chip on the upper corner. And I will tell them that, oh, do you know that Taiwan actually produced 83% of the chip used globally? So your PlayStation that you are using, your Nintendo Switch, they all use chip produced in Taiwan. And maybe last summer you were on that long wait list, try to get a giant bike so you can finally enjoy outdoor adventure. That giant bike that you are waiting for, that is also a Taiwanese brand. Or maybe you are using a Asus laptop watching Life of Pi. Chances are both Asus is a Taiwanese brand, and Life of Pi is directed by a Taiwanese American director and lead. And maybe on top of that, you really enjoy a cup of good bubble tea, which I show here. Bubble tea is also a proud Taiwanese invention, which is super sweet, so very bad for your health, but very good for your soul. And that's Taiwan right there for you. I use this slide to give my students a good understanding of Taiwan. And this is what I call strategic messaging. The purpose of doing so is to cultivate that positive relationship between the message sender and the message receiver. And that is why strategic storytelling is very, very important. And that's what I want to cover tonight in my presentation. So just to give you a quick outline, what I want to cover in tonight's presentation. I'm sorry, I've been catching a cold for a few days. First, I want to give you a brief history of Taiwan. So for those of you who are not so familiar with Taiwan, its history, the current development, that would probably give you some necessary contextual information. And then from there, I will move on to my second topic, which is the international coverage of Taiwan, this young, vibrant democracy. And then based on that, I want to end tonight's presentation with new opportunities and challenges. How can we reshape the story of Taiwan through strategic effort? So first, let's talk about the history of Taiwan. Of course, I'm gonna give you a very simplified version of the story, but hopefully that would give you a good understanding of this island. So Taiwan as an island was inhabited by indigenous people for thousands of years. But in 16th centuries, it was quote unquote discovered by Portuguese. Portuguese, they came to Taiwan, they saw the island, they were so impressed by its beauty, they call it Ella Formosa, meaning beautiful island. Portuguese were long gone, but the Formosa, the label stays in Taiwan. Until this day, you will see Formosa being used a lot, even in local conversation, as a way for Taiwanese people to refer to their state, to refer to their country as a beautiful island. After Portuguese in 17th centuries, Dutch came to Taiwan and colonized the island. They stayed there for a while, and then Chinese came over to Taiwan, defeated the Dutch, and made Taiwan a full province of the Chinese Empire. And China rules the island from the Ming Dynasty to Qing Dynasty until late 19th century, when Japanese gained control of Taiwan after its victory in the First Sino-Japanese War. And that was the very, very beginning of the Japanese imperialism in the Asian Pacific region. So the Japanese government, they really want to build Taiwan as this model colony. They put a lot of effort and resources into this island, try to build up the infrastructure, try to build up the educational system, try to boost the local economy, in the hope that it will prove to other countries that there is a justification for the Japanese imperialism. So Taiwan was under Japanese rule for about 50 years. Actually, my grandparents' generation, they were born into Japanese rule, Japanese colonization, and then they transitioned into the KMT governance after World War II. So after World War II in 2045, Taiwan was placed under the governance of Republic of China, ruled by the KMT, the Chiang Kai-shek administration. So this is the time that Taiwan being returned from Japan to China. But then again, I think we are all very aware this ongoing civil war in China between the KMT and the Communist Party. As a result, KMT lost China to the communist, and the KMT government had to flee to Taiwan and establish itself in Taiwan and establish martial law. That was 1949. After 1949, it took a few decades for Taiwan to establish itself as an economic power. So from the 50s to the 60s and 70s, this is a time that you really see this rapid economic growth domestically in Taiwan. However, internationally, externally, it's a very, very different story for Taiwan. In 1971, United Nations officially recognized PRC, People's Republic of China, as the only China. And because of that, ROC, Republic of China, which is Taiwan, decided to withdraw from UN. And that is the very beginning of the marginalization of Taiwan in the international society. So from the 60s to 70s, even though we saw rapid economic growth internally, externally, we started to experience that marginalization and that isolation. Once we move on to the 80s and 90s, within the Taiwanese society, with the end of martial law, with the lift of the ban of the formation of new political parties and news publications, you started to see this rapid democratization went into full motion in Taiwan. So you started to see a large scale of demonstrations. You saw the rise of political activists asking for the human right, for the freedom of press, for the freedom of speech, and they finally succeeded in their pursuit. In 2000, that was a remarkable year because that was the year that the dominant oppositional party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, was first elected to presidency, which ends KMT's 50-year plus rule and marking first transfer of executive power in Taiwan between two political parties. So 2000 was definitely a remarkable year to see this peaceful power transition in Taiwan. And that was the very first time a local political party, DPP, rose to presidency. But in 2008, there was another transition of executive power from DPP once again back to KMT under the Ma Ying-jeou administration for about 8 years. And in 2016, DPP once again elected to presidency. And in 2020, DPP won the presidential election again with 57.1% of the vote and retained its legislative majority. So this is a very, very short history of Taiwan. But if we look at the picture altogether, you would see that the first 400 years of the Taiwanese history is very, very much defined by colonization. First, you had Portuguese, and then Dutch, and then Chinese, and Japanese, and then Chinese again. So the beginning of the Taiwanese history is very much defined by colonization. Once we move on to the recent history of Taiwan, it was very much defined by liberalization, democratization, and the pursuit of human rights. So I think that's probably why until this day, for the Taiwanese people, they still experience this high level of identity crisis. Sometimes they don't even know how to identify themselves. So I typically use this survey to speak to that point, that phenomenon of identity crisis. So this is a survey done by National Chenchi University since the very early 90s. Every year, they would ask the Taiwanese population the same question, like, do you identify yourself as Chinese? Do you identify yourself as Taiwanese? Or do you identify yourself as both Taiwanese and Chinese with this dual identity? So from the slide, you can see that if they identify themselves as both, that's the pink line you have there. If they identify themselves more as Taiwanese, that's the green line there. If they identify themselves as Chinese, that's the blue line there. So if you look at that all together, you will see that the green line is going up rather quickly, especially after 2000, after DPP came to power. And you have another peak in 2020 when Taiwan saw what happened in Hong Kong in such proximity. And that is really another peak that you see the enforcement of Taiwanese identity. As of now, I think the majority of Taiwanese people actually identify themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese, and not both Taiwanese and Chinese. And I think that also tells you a lot about the evolution of the political landscape in Taiwan. So you would think that this island nation, this vibrant democracy with all this historical transformation, with this economic miracle, it must be a place to catch international media's attention. You would think that way, but in fact, it's not. For many, many years, Taiwan was never the priority in the international newsroom. And I want to share with you some data to prove that point. One data that we can use to examine that Taiwan is not the priority of the international newsroom was to see the establishment date of Foreign Correspondent Club in Asia. Foreign Correspondent Club is significant in two different ways. One, its established means that international media is paying attention to this specific country. That's why they established the Foreign Correspondents Club in that specific country. Another significance of the establishment of FCC is that it becomes a platform to cultivate reporters with deep understanding of the local situation, which means a reporter specialized in the local context. So to have FCC is a very, very good sign. The sign that the international media is paying attention to the country. So here you could see that in Asia, Japan was the first country to have FCC established in 1945, which is very understandable because Japan for the longest time was the most powerful country in Asia. And then you have Hong Kong, Singapore, English-speaking countries to establish FCC, which is also very understandable. And follow up, you have Thailand and India all have their FCC established in the mid-50s. You have to wait until the 80s to see FCC established in China, in both Beijing and Shanghai. And then in Indonesia, you saw the establishment of FCC as well. And then you have to wait until 1998 to see the establishment of FCC in Taiwan. And I think the starting date of FCC in Taiwan, which we call TFCC, is a very good indicator to tell you that international media is not interested in Taiwan. And on the other hand, the Taiwanese government was not active enough to pursue international foreign correspondent to come to Taiwan. Another data that I could share with you to see how the Western media often cover democratic Taiwan is the article published by Jonathan Sullivan and Don Lee in 2018. In this article, Jonathan Sullivan and Don Lee, they examines English-speaking media and their presentation of Taiwan in the past 20 years, from 1996 to 2016. Altogether, the two scholars, they found that about 18,000 articles was published by 65 major English newspapers in the past 20 years, and they are about Taiwan. And on average, Taiwan has generated 900 articles per year. So if you just look at the numbers, you'll be like, oh, so it is still get some tractions. Taiwan is getting some attention here, there. I mean, every year it got 900 articles mention this island nation. So it's not a bad thing at all. But that is to see this news coverage from a quantitative perspective. If you do a textual analysis of such coverage, takes a more qualitative approach, you would see that Taiwan is frequently framed through repetitive yet highly selective terms, such as US or China, or one China, or status quo, or tension, election, democracy, cross-strait relations, unification, independence, and trade. In other words, Taiwan is very much framed as a pawn in the game of US-China relations. It is a place that is voiceless, it is marginalized. When its agency was finally mentioned, it was typically mentioned as an economic entity. Right? So this repetition of such terms gives Taiwan some visibility, but this visibility is a oversimplified version of Taiwan and oftentimes very, very one-dimensional. A good example of this kind of like one-dimensional portrayal of Taiwan would be the story published by The Economist just last year. This is a article published last year in May by the magazine, The Economist. So on the left-hand side, you saw the cover of the magazine. The visual construction of this is Taiwan being in the center of the military radar, and on either side you have the Chinese flag and you have the American flag. So it's a very clear visual construction of Taiwan being a pawn in the game of US-China relations. And if you read deeper into the article itself, you would find that the article didn't really offer any new information about the situation in Taiwan. In fact, they didn't even offer sufficient information about their definition of danger. Is this danger caused by foreign forces? Is this self-inflicted? It was never clearly explained in the article itself. So with this highly sensationalized title, the article itself is a reiteration of a very, very old message that Taiwan is an arena for the rivalry between China and America. And actually, if you do a count of the word being used throughout the article, China was mentioned 28 times, US was mentioned 22 times, and Taiwan was only mentioned 16 times. When Taiwan supposed to be the main character of the story, because it is going to be the most dangerous place on earth, it was mentioned less than China and United States. And that tells you when the international media see Taiwan, they typically see it as a problem to be solved or as a victim of China's threat, never a subject in itself. This is a missed opportunity for the Taiwanese government, which is rather unfortunate. And this is where I want to talk about Joseph Nye's idea of soft power. Soft power was a concept developed by Joseph Nye in the 90s. Through this concept, he was talking about how countries can use attractions and persuasions to change minds and influence international behaviors. So you don't really have to use military force or coercion to force others to change their behavior, but rather you can use attractions and ideologies, which is actually more effective in persuasion. So cultural forces, political forces, value, positive global engagement are all effective tactics to achieve the agenda of soft power. And international coverage, international news coverage is definitely a tool of soft power. when you use it right, you can not only shape the global understanding of a specific country, you can actually advocate for international solidarity and international support. So that's exactly why Taiwan should try harder to reshape the international news coverage of this island nation and earn ourselves some positive coverage. So recently, we've been seeing some good example of soft power, positive coverage of Taiwan, which is a very, very good sign. A few examples include in 2019, when Taiwan legalizes same-sex marriage, which was historic and was the first for Asia. And this story was highly covered by international media. And Taiwan was highly praised throughout their storytelling. So I collected just a few major news outlets in both UK and the US, but you can see that in their headline, they didn't mention China, they didn't mention the US, they didn't even mention like controversy of the past of the same-sex marriage itself, but they rather frame the situation in a celebratory, heroic kind of framework, which is the very first time in a very, very long time that Taiwan being covered for its own right. Even celebrities like Ellen DeGeneres would pick up the story, share that on the Twitter, and our President Tsai Ing-wen, would reply to Ellen on Twitter and say, "Thank you, Ellen. I'm proud to serve this country where hashtag love wins, so everybody has the right to marry everyone." So this is a good example of soft power that I would say, a good successful story about the country itself, picked up by the international news media. Even though I have to say, honestly, some of them are still having issues about how to call Taiwan. Should we call that a state? Should we call that a country? Should we call that a self-governing democracy? But the fact that they didn't talk about Taiwan's relations to China or Taiwan's relations to US, but just focus on Taiwan and its domestic policy, I think that is a big achievement in itself. Another good example really was about the pandemic governance in Taiwan in the past 2 years. Several international media actually pick up the experience in Taiwan and talk about this democratic modeling that was able to have the pandemic under control. I mean, this is a country with 23 million people, but to this day, we only have about 800 deaths altogether in 2 years of time. So yes, losing to 800 people was tragic, but overall, I think we can still see this as a successful pandemic governance altogether. So a lot of countries actually pick up this experience and our model, which is democratic, in which we didn't use intrusive biotechnology to track your roundabout. We didn't do authoritarian lockdown to make sure that we control the pandemic. We actually use quite democratic approach to manage the situation, and that's why Taiwan was highly covered by international media. Even the leadership itself. So here you see our President Tsai Ing-wen once again being cast among other female leadership across the world. She was highly appraised in those stories, her leadership, her style, her resilience. And once again, that's another good example of soft power, I would say. Beyond that, Taiwan very recently, last year, started a new channel, a new platform called Taiwan Plus. This is a new platform established with twofold goals. On the one hand, it aims to introduce Taiwan to the international society through a variety of media production, from news program to more like a TV program, that they would introduce Taiwan to the international society. But on the other hand, they also want to bring the international society to Taiwan. So just last month, Taiwan Plus, for the very, very first time, sent its reporters to Ukraine to cover the situation on the ground and to draw the parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine. This is unprecedented because typically the Taiwanese newsroom, they don't really have this kind of budget to send reporters overseas. And when they are able to do so, they would rather send reporters to somewhere safer or somewhere closer, like in the Asian region. So for Taiwan Plus to send its reporters to Ukraine to cover the ongoing tension and conflict, this is for the very first time being done in a Taiwanese newsroom. And again, this shows you the ambition of Taiwan Plus, not only want to promote Taiwan to the international society, but also want to introduce Taiwanese international society to the Taiwanese audience and encouraging that intercultural dialogue between different communities. And last but not least, I think our government is very, very savvy about digital communication, especially social media. So over the past few years, they were able to use social media as an effective platform to introduce Taiwan to the international society. They actually launched a lot of collaborative projects with influencers across the world as a way to amplify Taiwan's international visibility. For example, in 2019, President Tsai launched this initiative called Be My Guest. So she sent out the invitation to influencers across the world and say, hey, why don't you come to Taiwan and spend a few nights at the presidential office building, which is the most exclusive space in Taiwan, I think I would argue. So actually, we received about 167 applications from influencers across the world. And at the end, 10 of them were selected to come to Taiwan and to stay at the presidential office for about 3 nights. And in this coverage, you saw that they were deeply impressed by this initiative and by the personality of the president. One influencer recalled that I cannot believe that President Tsai welcomed us in person. She introduced herself in sign language to show her respect to us because the influencer herself is having some hearing issues. And that's why President Tsai tried to greet her in sign languages. So this is a good soft power effort, try to collaborate with influencer on social media to push Taiwan to the world. But on the other hand, the administration also worked with YouTubers, foreign YouTubers in Taiwan to amplify Taiwan's visibility. So the one you are seeing here is a French YouTuber who is now famous in Taiwan. His name is Ku. He came to Taiwan a few years ago, was first here as a student to learn Mandarin, and later on he started his YouTube channel, and then he would make like daily videos to introduce local culture, local food, and then he gained attraction, he gained like a big following, and then he was invited to meet with President Tsai just to talk about the Taiwanese culture from his French perspective. And then with that introduction and that engagement, when he came back to France, he actually asked his grandmother to make a sweater for President Tsai with the national flag and the Chinese character of President Tsai's Chinese name. And then he gave it back to President Tsai. And of course, they make a video out of it. And the story itself was picked up by the international news media and become a very, very positive press coverage for Taiwan again. So what I'm saying is that the administration realized that international media, the traditional media, is one way to amplify our international presence. But social media, digital platform could be another way to tackle that same mission. So they are inviting influencers to come to Taiwan. They are also collaborating with foreign influencers based in Taiwan to collaborate stories. I really do think this is a good time for Taiwan because as China is tightening its control of its media landscape, we all see this escalating media censorship in China. A lot of reporters, for that reason, left China and relocate themselves either in South Korea or Singapore or Taiwan. So for the very first time in many, many years, we see the wave of foreign correspondents now coming to Taiwan and ready to stay in Taiwan for a long time to either cover China from Taiwan or to just cultivate the Taiwanese market. So this is a very, very, very good sign for Taiwan. I do hope that with more foreign correspondent residing in Taiwan, we are going to see from now on a less stereotype kind of coverage and stories about Taiwan with more complexity and more diversity. A few stories that I really, really like produced by a foreign correspondent are these two stories. Both of them are produced by Chris Horton, who is a reporter, worked for the New York Times. So for the first story, he was able to interview a laundry shop in central Taiwan. So this is a laundry shop with 50 years of history. And the shop owners would, model the forgotten garment as a way to remind their customer to come back to the store to pick up the clothes. It's a very, very cute, sweet story, but it also tells you a lot about Taiwanese culture and the humanity altogether. And then another story also written by Chris Horton was about stinky tofu. So it is about food. So also very locally uniqueness, but it is through food that Chris was able to tell a story about the immigrant culture in Taiwan, the ethnic diversity, and the colonial past of this island nation. And Chris was able to do that because he lived in Taiwan for about 20 years by now. He was very fluent in Taiwanese, Chinese altogether. And it is because of that deep understanding of the local context, he was able to produce stories like this, sometimes even hard stories through soft news lens, and was still able to pass the desk of editor-in-chief and then being published. So what I'm saying is that I do hope from now on, with more foreign correspondents residing in Taiwan, we are going to see more stories about Taiwan, not just about the conflict, not just about Taiwan being a pawn in geopolitical rivalry, but more about Taiwan itself, its culture, its people, its humanity altogether. So with that, I think I can end my presentation here, and I am ready for questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiaoning. And I am not ready for your lecture to be over. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your educating us on things. As a person from Oregon who fortunately had a business travel to Taiwan, during the past 20 years, any number of times, I've always enjoyed my visits and experiences in Taiwan. And at the same time, a little bit troubled that we don't get news, as you mentioned, very much from Taiwan, or that we have to go look for it. And there are some questions coming in on chat line, so I'll ask those in a minute. I am going ahead and putting in the link to Taiwan Plus in the chat line for people. I don't want them to click it right now, but come back to it. It's a great way to access some news from Taiwan in all categories. Some of the ones you mentioned, Taiwan's involvement in the activities in Ukraine, of course, are fascinating. For those of us who are in the high-tech business, the Northwest, our area has semiconductor business, Taiwan Semiconductor, and others are around. And there's been some criticisms from the founder, Morris Chang of TMSC, of the government, the US government's approach to trying to revitalize our semiconductor industry. So I think a few people, like maybe work for Intel or something like that around here, may get that kind of news. But we don't really get a lot of news about Taiwan, and even helpful criticisms, as well as the the nice stories that you provided some examples of, which Taiwan Plus does actually have all kinds of wonderful, sometimes they're rabbit holes, but you go down and find out what's going on in many areas. So I just put the link in the chat line. We'll come back to that. And your story might be the beginning of some further programs like this about Taiwan. So I'm going to begin. There's at least a couple of questions, and I'm going to begin with one of our board members, Dr. Jeff Kinkley, whose question is, through the 1980s, the ROC KMT government had lots of soft power initiatives in the US to influence public opinion. They had information centers, etc., presenting Taiwan as the alternate or the, quote, real China. Are there obstacles to Taiwan having similar initiatives today on its own behalf? And if so, what are these obstacles? Financial, PRC opposition, division within Taiwan on how to represent Taiwan, and at least Taiwan's importance to the global economy and culture should be an asset. So I think the question is, are there obstacles to Taiwan having similar initiatives today? And maybe some of us in the audience don't really know too much about the information centers that have existed that are in, like, for example, in Seattle and other places. But if you had time to rest from your lecture for just a minute, why don't we take Dr. Kinkley's question first?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think from the 80s to about 2000, especially 2000 to 2008, probably under the Chen Shui-bian administration, I think that was the time that the U.S.-Taiwan relationship was a little bit bumpy, I would say, because the President Chen at that time was known for his, I would say, aggressiveness and some political assertion, and that was not completely in line with the American interest. So there was definitely a time that we saw some tension between the U.S.-Taiwan relations. But I do feel like in recent years, especially in the recent 5 years, I would say, especially under the Tsai Ing-wen administration, the Taiwanese government has been trying very, very hard to repair that relationship. In fact, we saw the establishment of new Taiwan-focused think tank in DC, the Taiwan Institute in DC, which is a vibrant, active platform for US-Taiwan engagement and collaboration. That is a very, very good sign in itself. I think our new representative to the US, Xiaobi King, has been doing a very, very good job to invite US delegate, high-level delegate to come to Taiwan. And it happened several times, especially through the pandemic. US been giving Taiwan vaccination when it was needed the most last year, and several times. There are the arrival of several senators to reiterate that the US-Taiwan relationship is rock solid. So all of these are great signs, I think. I hope from here we will see better improvement in terms of Taiwan's soft power effort, especially in the context of the US.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Will who asks, how do you or a younger generation in Taiwan want to apply soft power to the government in Beijing? Since Beijing is the main threat, I think is the word, do you want to lobby Beijing at all?
I do think we all want to have a dialogue. I think that's the purpose of soft power, right? The idea of soft power is really to encourage engagement and conversation, and hopefully through that to establish mutual understanding and mutual consensus. And this has to be a two-way effort. This cannot just be a one-sided effort. So when we try to do that, we hope it will be received by the Beijing government as well, which sometimes, especially now seeing the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong, and the censorship in China altogether, it creates this fear in a lot of people's mind, like what to say, what not to say, and the fear itself is very, very real. But if I can think of a soft power strategy to engage people in China, I think pop culture is always effective. Um, a lot of people in Taiwan actually enjoy watching, um, you know, TV shows, TV reality shows, period dramas produced by China. It has a huge audience, fan base in Taiwan as well. And I think for quite some time, Taiwanese singers and actresses are very welcome in China as well. So these pop culture exchange could be a good way to further that soft power initiative from between Taiwan and China, I think.
That's terrific. That's really interesting to me. Are there any pop culture, and interject here, exchanges of any type existing now between Taiwan and Japan? Because you notice that, and I think you commented some years ago on a film in which uh, the Taiwanese girl fell in love with the Japanese soldier,
Yeah.
created some controversy, but there's a lot of people with interest in manga, of course, manga coming out of Japan, but also very much part of Chinese, popular entertainment are reading comics, manhua. And I've been to a great comics museum in Taiwan, actually. It's in a small town. But in any case, this kind of leads to me wondering more also about Japan's coverage of Taiwan and how active they are in the Foreign Correspondents Club or things like that. So we're kind of diverting to a little bit of the Taiwan-Japan connection, which I think they might be a bit ahead of our approach to dealing with Taiwan. You can comment?
Oh, Japanese pop culture has a great influence in Taiwan for sure, and for a very, very long time. My generation, we actually grew up with Japanese pop culture. I grew up watching Japanese TV show, talent show, Japanese manga, animation. So it's either like American pop culture or Japanese pop culture. That's how I socialize myself as a young child. Back in Taiwan in the 90s. That's really, really how I grew up. Now the younger generation in Taiwan, they are more interested in K-pop, Korean pop culture. And that, I would say, is the greatest soft power project initiated by South Korea. I think all countries across the world are taking notes, try to learn like how this collaboration between government and industry all together would create such phenomenon, and not only local or regional, now it's global. I think we are all seeing BTS everywhere here in United States. A lot of my students are actually trying to learn Korean, and they will book this very expensive flight just to go to Los Angeles to watch like a BTS concert. And they will be like, Professor, I'm sorry, I cannot make it to your class because I have to go to this concert. So that really tells you that pop culture is the ultimate weapon for soft power and for public persuasion and attraction. So back to your question, yes, Japanese culture for pop culture for a very, very long time play a crucial role in Taiwanese society. And I think this has a lot to do with the advancement of their media production, but also has a lot to do with the colonial past shared between Taiwan and Japan. I think Taiwan still until this day has even as a previous colony of Japan, we still think very fondly of this nation. So if you look back at the record during the March 11 earthquake that happened in 2011, among all nations across the world, Taiwan was actually the country that donated the most to Japan. It was Taiwan who made the most donation to Japan to help them in a time of difficulty. And for that, until this day, I think Japanese public figures are still using opportunities here there to express their appreciation for such support during a very difficult time. So yeah, Taiwan, Japan, I think the tie is there, and I think it's getting stronger and stronger. And then we all see the quad between US, Japan, Australia, and India now try to safeguard the Pacific Ocean region. So with that, and with the strategic position of Taiwan, I think this alignment, this collaboration between US, China, US, Japan, Taiwan is only going to go stronger and stronger in the coming years, I think.
I think we might have time for one more question from Jeff Kinkley. What is the public reaction in Taiwan to the Ukraine situation? Have any commentators in Taiwan or elsewhere compared February 28, 1947 to February 24, 2022 in the Ukraine?
That's a fascinating question. That's really, really interesting. And I can definitely see the parallel between the two because it's the nature of massacre, right? The mass killing. So I can definitely see the parallel between the two. But so far, I think in terms of the public discourse of Ukraine, the Ukrainian situation in Taiwan, it's most likely, it's mostly about the solidarity stand with Ukraine. We want to learn from Ukrainians' resilience, how they defend themselves, how they are so determined to fight back, to safeguard their country. The interesting thing is that I think right after the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war in late March, there was a survey being done in Taiwan, ask the Taiwanese people, like, are you willing to defend the country if it was attacked by military forces? And for the very first time in Taiwan, such survey being done with such high number. More than 70% of the respondents say that they are willing to defend their country if necessary, which is a number that we've never seen in the past. So in a way, I also feel like Taiwan is very informed by the international situation. So when there is something happening in Hong Kong, immediately influence the public opinion. When there is something happening in Ukraine, immediately reshape the public discourse. But I think we also need to be very careful because you will see a lot of discourse like today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan, or if the US is leaving Afghanistan, why do you think they will stay in Taiwan? Or if the US is not going to defend Ukraine with military, why are they going to defend Taiwan, right? So it is very easy to draw that parallel, and I can totally see why, but I also think we need to be very, very careful with such comparison because the situation is very different from Ukraine and Taiwan.
Well, thank you. We're getting right on the hour now, and so I want to remind everyone that Chiaoning is on a much later time frame than we are. So I want to keep to the schedule and look at any other questions that come in to maybe answer by email later. And I do thank everyone who's participating this evening, and that this recording will be on YouTube when we post it to share with the registrants that didn't make it tonight, who maybe got caught up in the tailwind of Air Force One leaving Portland earlier today. But in any case, I do want to ask everyone to visit northwestchina.org for our upcoming schedule, our event next week with Ron Shang, a filmmaker, which will be our first in-person and hybrid event at PNCA and on Zoom, and subsequent China chats next month, including a really great one on diversity. We just posted the registration for that, and it is late, so I usually like to go into more detail about future programs, but come back to our website, everyone, and I hope we'll have a chance to have Chiaoning come back to Northwest China Council sometime in the future. So thank you so much. I'm going to end with the big applause. And I think John is the one. I want to thank our executive director and web genius, John, who is in the background, and he is the person recording this. And I usually just keep talking until he turns me off. But once again, Chiaoning, thank you so much for your time and your wonderful talk this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.